Hey buddy, welcome back. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, whatever kind of day you've had, I want you to go ahead and get comfortable now. Turn the lights down low if you haven't already. Pull that blanket up over your shoulders. Let your head sink into the pillow. There's nowhere you need to be for the next little while except right here, floating along with me through a very old, very strange, very human story. Before we start, if this is your first time with us, welcome to the channel. We tell long, slow, quiet stories from history, the kind of stories that used to be told out loud by firelight in rooms without electricity, back when a good storyteller was one of the most valuable people in a village. If you like this kind of thing, consider tapping that subscribe button, just quietly, no rush, and maybe leave the video running while you drift off. We'll be here again tomorrow night with another one. Tonight we're going back a very long way. We're going back before Rome, before the Parthenon even had its final marble column standing tall and white in the Athenian sun. We're going back to a time that the Greeks themselves considered legendary, a hazy, half-remembered age of bronze swords and painted ships, of kings who might have been real men wrapped in centuries of myth, of monsters that may have started as something far more ordinary than the stories let on. This is the story of Theseus, the boy who lifted a boulder with his bare hands, the young man who walked rather than sailed along a dangerous coastal road just to prove something to himself, the prince who volunteered to be sent to his death so that other people's children wouldn't have to be, and of course, the man who is remembered more than anything else for going into a maze built to keep a monster hidden and coming back out again. Just settle in. Let your breathing slow down. We've got a long night ahead of us, and there's no reason to rush through any of it. I want you to imagine for a moment the world as it might have looked around 3,300 years ago, somewhere along the rocky coastline of the Aegean Sea. There were no history books yet. There was no writing, not really, not the kind that ordinary people used. What existed instead were stories, carried from one mouth to another, changed a little each time they were told, the way a smooth stone in a river gets rounder and rounder with every year the water passes over it. The story of Theseus comes to us from exactly that kind of place. It isn't history in the way we usually mean the word, with dates we can check and documents we can hold in our hands. It's something older and stranger than that. It's myth, but myth that seems to be sitting right on top of something real. The way morning fog sits on top of a hillside, is there even though you can't quite see its shape. Archaeologists have actually found real things that seem to echo pieces of this story. On the island of Crete, there's a vast, sprawling palace at a place called Knossos, so enormous and complicated in its layout, with so many rooms and corridors and staircases, that when the first excavators wandered its ruins in the early 1900s, they began to wonder aloud if this might be the very labyrinth the old stories spoke of. There really was a civilization on Crete, one the archaeologist Arthur Evans named the Minoans, after the legendary King Minos. It really did dominate trade across the Aegean Sea for a long stretch of the Bronze Age. And there really is evidence, in the wall paintings of that palace, of young men and women leaping over the backs of charging bulls, a practice we still don't fully understand, somewhere between sport, ritual, and something close to a dangerous kind of dance. None of that proves the myth happened exactly as the storytellers told it, but it does something almost more interesting. It suggests that somewhere, buried under centuries of retelling and embellishment, there might be a kernel of memory, of an actual relationship between the mainland Greeks and the island of Crete, one that involved tribute, danger, and maybe even young people sent across the water for reasons we can only partly guess at now. Tonight, I'm not going to try to separate every thread of myth from every thread of possible history. That's not really the point of an evening like this one. Instead, I want to walk you through the story the way the ancient Greeks themselves would have heard it, slowly, in pieces, from childhood onward. The way you might have heard it as a kid sitting near a hearth in Athens sometime around 600 years before the birth of Christ, listening to an old woman or a wandering singer tell you about the hero who freed their city from a terrible burden. We'll talk about his strange birth and the sword hidden under a rock. We'll walk the long, dangerous road from Troezen to Athens, where a teenage boy chose to fight bandits and monsters rather than take the safe way by sea. We'll sit with him in the dark hold of a ship bound for Crete, one of 14 young Athenians sent as tribute to a monster. We'll follow him into the labyrinth itself, and we'll talk honestly about what that story might have meant to the people who first told it, in a world where sacrifice, both symbolic and literal, was simply part of how ancient societies made sense of a frightening universe. And we'll follow him out the other side, too, into a longer, more complicated life than most people remember. Because the truth is, killing the Minotaur is really just the middle of Theseus's story, not the end of it. There's a whole life before it and a whole life after it, full of ordinary human details, mistakes, homesickness, love, grief, and the slow work of building a city. So let your eyes close if they want to. Let your body sink down into whatever you're lying on. I'll do the talking. All you have to do is listen. 2 kings and a boulder lets go inside a small coastal town called Troezen, tucked into the Peloponnese, that leg-shaped stretch of land hanging off the bottom of mainland Greece. This isn't a grand or famous place. It's the kind of small kingdom that history mostly forgets, a scatter of stone houses, olive groves climbing the hillsides, fishing boats pulled up onto a narrow beach, the smell of salt and wood smoke hanging in the evening air. I want you to imagine the harbor at dusk. The fishermen are hauling in their last nets of the day, and you can hear the wet slap of rope against wood, the tired grunts of men who have been out on the water since before dawn. Somewhere behind them, up on a low hill, sits the palace of King Pythias, not the towering marble palace you might picture from later Greek history, but something more modest, built of sun-dried mud brick and rough stone, with a great hall lit by oil lamps and a central hearth that never quite stops smoking. Pythias was known, even among kings, as an unusually wise man. People said he had studied the art of speaking well, that he understood the movements of the stars, that visitors sometimes came to Troezen not for trade but simply to sit and listen to him talk. It was to this court that a king from Athens once came, quietly, almost secretly, seeking advice. That king was named Aegeus, and his story up to this point had already been a sad one. He had been married twice, and neither marriage had given him a child. In the world of Bronze Age Greece, this wasn't just a private sorrow. A king without an heir was a kingdom without a future, an invitation for ambitious relatives to start eyeing the throne long before the old king was even in the ground. Aegeus had brothers and Aegeus had nephews, nearly 50 of them if the old stories are to be believed, all of them circling like gulls around a fishing boat, waiting for scraps. So Aegeus did what any anxious, desperate king of that era might do. He traveled to Delphi, to the temple of Apollo, to ask the oracle there whether he would ever have a son. Now, I want you to picture what that must have been like, because it wasn't a simple errand. Delphi sits high up on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a journey of many days by foot and by sea from Athens. The temple itself was carved into the mountainside, wrapped in mist that rolled down from the peaks above, and there was a strange, sweet, slightly sickly smell that visitors described rising from a crack in the earth beneath the inner sanctuary. Modern geologists have actually found evidence of natural gas seeping up through that fault line, which may explain the trance-like state the priestess, called the Pythia, seemed to fall into when she delivered her prophecies. Aegeus asked his question, and the answer he received was strange even by the standards of oracles, who were famous for speaking in riddles rather than plain sentences. The Pythia told him not to loosen the mouth of his wineskin until he had returned home to Athens. Imagine standing there, a grown king, having traveled for days to hear this, and being told something that sounds almost like nonsense. Aegeus didn't understand it. He left Delphi more confused than when he'd arrived, and on his way back to Athens, he stopped in Troezen to visit his old friend Pythias, hoping the wise king might help him untangle the riddle. Pythias listened carefully, and here's where the story takes a turn that feels uncomfortably familiar to us now, even thousands of years later, because it involves an old man using his cleverness for something less than noble. Pythias understood the oracle's words in a way Aegeus hadn't. He believed it meant that Aegeus should not have intimate relations with any woman until he returned to Athens, or perhaps that some current of fate meant his next child would become great. Whatever his exact interpretation, Pythias kept it to himself, and that night he arranged for his own daughter, a young woman named Aethra, to be brought quietly to Aegeus's bed. We should sit with this for a moment, rather than rushing past it, because it's a part of the story that ancient audiences would have understood very differently than we do now, and it's worth being honest about that difference rather than smoothing it over. In the world these stories come from, women, especially unmarried daughters, often had very little say in decisions like this. Aethra herself is barely given a voice in most versions of the tale. What we're told is simply that Pythias wanted a grandson with the blood of an Athenian king in his veins, a connection that would raise the standing of his small coastal kingdom, and he arranged things to make that happen. There's a stranger layer still, one that later Greek storytellers added, perhaps to soften the story or perhaps because they genuinely believed something like it. Some versions say that afterward, Aethra also had a dream or a vision in which she waded out to a small island near Troezen called Sphaeria and lay there with the sea god Poseidon himself. In this version of the tale, Theseus has two fathers at once, a mortal one and a divine one, which was a common way for Greek myths to explain why a hero seemed to have abilities beyond what an ordinary person could manage. It let the story have it both ways. Theseus could be a real historical king with royal blood, and also a demigod capable of superhuman feats. The next morning, before he set off back toward Athens, Aegeus did something quietly remarkable. He led Aethra out to a huge boulder near the shore, and beneath that rock he hid his sandals and his sword. Then he told her something that I think is worth slowing down on, because it's really the emotional heart of everything that follows. He said that if she bore him a son, she should raise the boy without telling him who his father was. She should say nothing about Athens, nothing about kings, nothing at all, until the boy grew strong enough to move that boulder on his own. Only then, when he could lift the stone and retrieve the sandals and the sword hidden beneath it, should she tell him the truth and send him to Athens to find his father. Think about what kind of man does this. Aegeus wasn't being cruel, not exactly, but he also wasn't being especially brave. He was protecting himself. If word got out in Athens that he had a son waiting somewhere in Troezen, his nephews, hungry for the throne, might send assassins to make sure that child never grew old enough to challenge them. By hiding the boy's identity behind a test of pure physical strength, Aegeus was creating a kind of natural filter. Only a son with real power, real capability, someone strong enough to survive what was likely to be a dangerous world, would ever make it to Athens at all. And so Aegeus sailed home, back to a city he ruled but did not feel secure in, leaving behind a young woman who would spend years alone raising a child whose whole identity rested on a rock too heavy to move. I want you to imagine Aethra in the months after Aegeus left. Picture her walking along that same beach, watching her belly grow round, feeling the small movements of a life that was going to complicate everything about her future. There's something quietly moving about a woman carrying a secret like that inside her own body, not just the child, but the entire weight of what he was going to have to become. When the boy was born, they named him Theseus. Some ancient writers connected the name to the Greek word meaning to place or to establish, a nod to the sandals and sword that had been set down and left waiting. Whether that etymology is accurate or just a clever bit of storytelling added centuries later, it captures something true about the whole shape of his childhood. Everything about Theseus's early life was, in a sense, a kind of waiting. Waiting to grow. Waiting to become strong enough. Waiting for a truth that his mother alone possessed. Let's stay in Troezen a little longer, because I think it's worth imagining what an ordinary day might have looked like for a boy like that, growing up not knowing he was royalty at all. A boyhood by the sea. Imagine this for a moment. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, running barefoot along a dirt path that winds down from the palace of his grandfather toward the sea. His feet are hardened from years of going without sandals most of the day, the way most children in this world did, since leather was expensive and childhood feet grow too fast to justify replacing shoes every season. The air smells like thyme and wild sage, crushed underfoot as he runs, mixed with the salt tang blowing in off the water. Somewhere behind him, his mother Aethra is probably calling his name, the way mothers everywhere have always called after children who run faster than their voices can follow. We don't often stop to think about what daily life actually felt like for a child in the Greek Bronze Age, so let's slow down here and really sit inside it for a moment. There was no school in the way we understand it now, no books, no writing lessons for most people, since literacy, where it existed at all in this era, was usually confined to scribes keeping palace records, not something an ordinary boy, even a royal one, would necessarily learn. Instead, A boy like Theseus would have been raised through observation and imitation. He would have watched the men of the household practice with spears and hunting bows in the courtyard. He would have learned to swim in the shallow coves near the harbor, since Troezen's whole economy depended on the sea. He would have eaten simply, mostly barley porridge and bread, olives pressed from the trees on the hillside, goat cheese wrapped in fig leaves, fish caught fresh that same morning, and on special occasions, a bit of roasted meat, usually goat or pig, since cattle were too valuable to slaughter casually. At night, the household would gather around the central hearth in the great hall, and this is where a lot of the actual education of a Bronze Age child took place, in the stories told after supper. Old men would recount the deeds of ancestors and half-remembered heroes. Someone might sing, accompanied by a simple stringed instrument, songs about gods and floods and wars fought generations earlier. Firelight would flicker against the smoke-stained walls, throwing long shadows that made the old stories feel closer and more alive than they might in daylight. It's worth pausing here to imagine the texture of that darkness too, because we live now in a world so full of artificial light that we've almost forgotten what real nighttime used to feel like. In Troezen, once the sun went down, the world became genuinely dark, lit only by the moon, the stars, and whatever oil lamps or hearth fires a household could afford to keep burning. Children would have grown up far more attuned to the sky than most of us are today, able to read the seasons by which constellations rose and set, comforted or frightened by the moon's changing shape in ways that feel almost foreign to us now. Theseus grew up inside all of this without knowing the central fact that would define his future. He knew his grandfather Pythias was a king. He knew his mother Aethra held some quiet, unspoken authority in the household beyond what an ordinary unmarried woman might have had. But when he asked, as children do, about his father, the answer he received was always vague, always deflected. Some stories say Aethra told him simply that his father was the god Poseidon, letting the boy grow up believing himself the son of the sea, which, in a strange way, may have been the version closest to what she genuinely believed, or wanted to believe, about that mysterious night on the island of Sphaeria. I want you to imagine what that must have done to a growing boy's sense of himself, being raised half in myth and half in silence. There must have been a restlessness in him, a sense that something essential about his own story was being withheld. Ancient storytellers love to describe Theseus, even as a young man, as unusually strong, unusually brave, drawn toward difficult tasks the way some people are simply drawn toward difficult questions. Whether that's historical truth or simply the natural shape a hero's childhood takes once storytellers know how the tale ends, it's hard to say. But it makes for a compelling picture all the same, a boy testing his own strength against the world around him, without quite knowing why. There's a particular story from this stretch of his childhood that ancient writers love to tell, involving his cousin, or possibly nephew depending on which version you follow, a young man named Heracles. Yes, that Heracles, the one who would go on to complete his own famous 12 labors. As the story goes, Heracles visited Troezen at one point while still fairly young himself, and during a meal, he removed his lion's skin cloak and set it aside. The other boys of the household, seeing this unfamiliar object, apparently mistook it for a real, sleeping lion and scattered in terror. Theseus, according to the tale, was the only one who didn't run. Instead, he supposedly grabbed an axe from a woodpile and prepared to fight the beast himself, only realizing his mistake once it was pointed out to him. It's a small story, almost a joke really, the kind of anecdote a grandmother might tell to explain why a particular child grew up to be brave rather than reckless, or reckless rather than brave, depending on how you want to read it. But I like it, because it gives us a glimpse of Theseus not as a distant marble statue hero, but as an actual child once, capable of making mistakes, capable of misjudging a situation, and still willing to act anyway. Years passed like this. Seasons of olive harvests and fishing trips and long winter nights by the fire. And slowly, the way it happens to every child eventually, Theseus grew from a boy into something closer to a man. The Boulder lets go back down to that stretch of shoreline outside Troezen, the one with the great boulder Aegeus had placed his sandals and sword beneath all those years earlier. I want you to imagine this scene slowly, the way it might have unfolded on an ordinary afternoon that turned out, without anyone quite realizing it in the moment, to be the day everything changed. Aethra had waited a long time for this. She had watched her son grow taller each year, watched his shoulders broaden, watched him wrestle with the other young men of Troezen and win more often than he lost. At some point, whether through some quiet, private calculation of her own or perhaps a nudge from her father Pythias, she decided the time had finally come. She led Theseus down to the shore, to that same rock she had stood beside as a young woman all those years before, and she told him at last the truth. She told him about the visiting king named Aegeus. She told him about the sandals and the sword and the promise made in the dark before dawn. And then she told him what he needed to do. Try to imagine what it might have felt like to hear this for the first time. As a young man who had spent his entire life believing his father was either unknown or possibly a god, only to learn instead that his father was a living, breathing king in a city across the water, a king who had left behind a kind of test rather than simply coming back for him. Theseus walked to the boulder. It was massive, the kind of stone that would have taken a team of oxen and ropes to move under ordinary circumstances, deliberately chosen, we're told, precisely because it required extraordinary strength to shift. He set his hands against its rough, sun-warmed surface, planted his feet in the sand and pushed. I don't think we need to dwell too long on the mechanics of this moment, because the point was never really about physics. It was about proof. When Theseus lifted that boulder and rolled it aside, revealing the sandals and sword that had waited beneath it for years, untouched by rust or rot in most versions of the tale, he wasn't just completing a strength test. He was stepping, for the first time, into an identity that had been waiting for him his entire life. He picked up the sandals. He picked up the sword. And now came the real decision, the one that would define the rest of his story far more than the boulder ever could. Aethra and Pythias both urged him to sail to Athens. It made sense, practically speaking. A ship could carry him across the Saronic Gulf in a day or two, avoiding entirely the long, treacherous coastal road that wound along the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, a road infamous, even in that era, for the bandits and monsters said to prowl it. Theseus refused. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells us something essential about who this young man was, or at least who the ancient storytellers wanted him to be. He had just learned that his father was a king, that a whole city and a whole legacy were waiting for him. The safe, sensible thing to do would have been to take the boat, arrive quietly and quickly, and begin the slow work of being recognized and accepted by a father he had never met. Instead, Theseus chose the harder road, quite literally. Some ancient writers say he made this choice out of admiration for his cousin Heracles, the same hero from that childhood story with the lion's skin, who by this point had grown into the most famous monster slayer in the Greek world, wandering the countryside performing his own legendary labors. Theseus, the stories suggest, wanted to prove he could do something similar. He wanted, in a sense, to earn his own reputation before he ever set foot in his father's city, rather than simply arriving as an unknown young man claiming a throne through blood alone. Whatever his exact reasoning, he strapped on the sandals, buckled his father's sword at his hip, and set off walking north along the coast, toward a road that everyone in that part of Greece knew to avoid if they possibly could. Let's follow him. The road of bandits, I want you to picture this road the way an ordinary traveler of that time would have experienced it. It ran along the narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece, a route squeezed between steep cliffs on one side and the sea on the other in several stretches, the kind of terrain that makes an ambush almost embarrassingly easy to pull off. Merchants avoided it when they could. Those who had to use it traveled in groups, armed, moving quickly, never lingering. This was, in a sense, the ancient equivalent of a highway known for violence, the kind of place parents warned their children about, the kind of place a lone traveler simply didn't walk unless they had no other choice, or unless, like Theseus, they were deliberately seeking out a challenge. The first danger he encountered, according to the old stories, was a man named Periphetes who lived near the town of Epidaurus. Periphetes carried an enormous bronze club, and he used it to kill travelers who passed through his territory, which had earned him the nickname the Club Bearer throughout the region. Some versions of the myth claim he was a son of the smith god Hephaestus, which might explain both his unusual strength and his association with a heavy metal weapon rather than the more common sword or spear. Theseus fought him, defeated him, and took the club for himself. From this point forward in the story, that same weapon becomes something of a signature for Theseus, a visual detail that ancient vase painters love to include, showing the young hero carrying the very club that had once belonged to the man who tried to kill him. There's something quietly satisfying about that detail, the idea that a hero's early trials leave physical marks on him, tools he carries forward rather than simply memories he leaves behind. Continuing north, Theseus reached the Isthmus of Corinth, that narrow neck of land where a man named Sinis lived, a bandit with an especially gruesome method of dealing with travelers. Sinis had the strength to bend tall pine trees down to the ground, and he would trick or force his victims into being tied between two bent trees at once. When he released them, the trees would spring back upright violently, tearing the victim apart between them. This earned him the grim nickname, the Pine Bender. Theseus, recognizing the same cruelty that had defined Periphetes, defeated Sinis using his own method against him, a pattern that recurs throughout this stretch of the story, and seems to carry a clear moral logic underneath the violence. Each of these bandits meets an end that mirrors the exact cruelty they had inflicted on others. It's not simply that Theseus is strong enough to win these fights. It's that a kind of natural justice is being restored to a road that had been ruled by fear for far too long. If we let ourselves think about this for a moment beyond the myth itself, it's worth remembering that roads like this really did exist in the ancient world, and banditry really was a persistent, practical danger for ordinary travelers for centuries. There was no unified policing system stretching across ancient Greece the way we think of law enforcement today. Justice, especially along remote stretches of road far from any city's direct authority, was often a matter of whoever had the strength and the will to enforce it. Stories like this one may have functioned, in part, as a kind of wish fulfillment for people who had to travel these dangerous routes themselves, imagining a hero clearing the road so that ordinary merchants and shepherds and mothers with children might someday walk it safely. Theseus continued on. Near the town of Crete, he encountered not a bandit this time, but an enormous wild sow, a monstrous pig that had been terrorizing the local farmers, destroying crops and killing livestock. In some versions of the story, this creature is even given a name of its own, Phaedra, and is said to have been the offspring of two other, even more terrifying monsters from earlier Greek mythology. Theseus killed the beast, freeing the farmers of Crete from a threat that had clearly been disrupting their ability to survive off their own land for some time. I like pausing on this particular encounter because it's a little different from the others. It isn't a human bandit this time, punished for cruelty toward travelers. It's a direct threat to the food supply of an entire farming community, the kind of danger that would have resonated deeply with an audience who understood, on a gut level, just how fragile agricultural life could be. One bad season, one marauding animal left unchecked, and a whole village might go hungry through the winter. Further along the coastal road, near the cliffs by Megara, Theseus came upon a man named Sciron. Sciron had a particularly theatrical method of murder. He would force travelers to kneel and wash his feet at the edge of a high cliff overlooking the sea, and while they were bent low in that vulnerable position, he would kick them off the cliff into the water below, where, according to the stories, an enormous sea turtle waited to devour whatever fell. Theseus, naturally, dealt with Sciron exactly as Sciron had dealt with his victims. Not far after this came Troezen, a man who challenged travelers to wrestling matches that were rigged from the start, since Troezen would simply kill anyone who lost against him, which, given his skill, was essentially everyone. Theseus accepted the challenge and, in what several ancient sources credit as one of the earliest examples of a formal wrestling technique in Greek storytelling, defeated Troezen through skill rather than pure brute strength, a detail that hints at how seriously ancient Greek culture took the sport of wrestling as a refined, technical discipline rather than simply a test of muscle. And then, finally, came the last, and in many ways most memorable of these encounters, a man named Procrustes. Procrustes kept an inn along the road, and on the surface, he seemed like a generous host, offering weary travelers a bed for the night. But his bed had a cruel secret. It was, depending on which version of the story you hear, either too short or too long for every single guest who lay down in it. And Procrustes had a solution for this mismatch that was as horrifying as it was strangely methodical. If a traveler was too tall for the bed, he would cut off whatever portion of their legs hung over the edge. If they were too short, he would stretch their body on a rack until it fit. Theseus, once again applying the same grim symmetry that had marked each of these encounters, forced Procrustes onto his own bed and gave him exactly the same treatment he had given his victims. If you've ever heard the modern phrase Procrustean, used to describe a situation where reality is forced to fit some rigid, arbitrary standard regardless of the damage that causes, this is where it comes from. One small linguistic echo of a Bronze Age myth still quietly living inside our language today. By the time Theseus finally reached the outskirts of Athens, he had walked the length of one of the most dangerous roads in the ancient Greek world and cleared it of every threat that had made it so feared. Word of these deeds, according to the old storytellers, had already begun traveling ahead of him faster than his own footsteps, carried by merchants and travelers relieved to find the road suddenly, unexpectedly safe. Let's pause here for a moment before we follow him into the city, because I think it's worth sitting quietly with something. Theseus arrived at Athens not as an unknown young stranger claiming royal blood through a story no one could verify, but as someone whose reputation had already begun to precede him, earned through action rather than birthright alone. That distinction mattered enormously in a world where legitimacy often had to be proven again and again, generation after generation, through deeds rather than paperwork. A city on edge. Imagine, now, the city of Athens as it might have looked to a young man walking in from the coastal road for the very first time. This wasn't yet the Athens of towering marble temples and grand democratic assemblies that we tend to picture when we think of ancient Greece. That Athens was still centuries away. This Athens, the Bronze Age Athens of Theseus's story, was smaller, rougher, centered around a fortified hilltop we now call the Acropolis, with a scattering of homes and workshops spreading out below it, protected by walls built from massive, roughly hewn stones. The air in the city would have smelled different from the quiet coastal roads Theseus had just walked. More smoke, more crowded, the mingled sense of a working city, leather being tanned, bread baking in communal ovens, the sharp tang of bronze being worked in smithies, animals being kept in small pens between houses. Narrow streets, unpaved and dusty in summer, thick with mud after rain, wound between houses built close together for protection and warmth. Theseus arrived here as a stranger, and this is an important detail the old storytellers were careful to include, because it sets up everything that happens next. His father Aegeus did not recognize him. Why would he? He had left Troezen decades earlier, before Theseus was even born, and had no way of knowing what his son might look like, whether he had even survived childhood at all in a world where child mortality was tragically common. But someone else in the palace recognized exactly who Theseus might be, and that person was Medea. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because Medea is one of the most famous figures in all of Greek mythology, a powerful sorceress with her own long, dramatic history involving the hero Jason and the quest for the Golden Fleece. a story we might tell on another night here on this channel. By the time she appears in the story of Theseus, Medea had fled her previous life and found her way to Athens, where she had become Aegeus's wife, and where she had given him a son of his own, a boy named Metis. Medea, with her gift for sorcery and foresight, recognized immediately, before Aegeus himself did, that this powerful young stranger who had just arrived in the city was in fact Aegeus's firstborn son from Troezen, the one whose existence Aegeus had likely never fully explained to her. And she understood, with the sharp clarity of someone protecting her own child's future, exactly what this meant. If Theseus was acknowledged as Aegeus's true heir, her own son Metis would lose any claim to the Athenian throne. So Medea did what she had done before in her long, dramatic life. She turned to poison. She convinced Aegeus, according to the old stories, that this unfamiliar young stranger was dangerous, perhaps a spy or an assassin sent by one of Aegeus's many nephews who had been waiting so long for the old king to die without an heir. She suggested a plan. Invite the stranger to a feast and quietly serve him a cup of poisoned wine. Imagine the scene at that feast. A long table, oil lamps casting flickering light across the room, the low murmur of court officials and guards, Aegeus seated at the head of the table, uneasy, watching this powerful young stranger everyone in the palace was suddenly whispering about. A cup is brought to Theseus, filled with wine that Medea has already tainted. But before Theseus lifts the cup to drink, he does something that changes everything. As was customary at the time, before eating, Theseus draws his sword to cut a portion of meat for himself, or, in some versions, simply to demonstrate his identity, perhaps sensing the tension in the room and wanting to establish himself with the very sword his father had left beneath the boulder all those years ago. Aegeus sees the sword. I want you to imagine this moment slowly, because it's one of the most emotionally powerful beats in the entire story. Here is an old king who has spent decades wondering, perhaps quietly grieving, whether he would ever have a legitimate heir, whether that strange night in Troezen and the sandals and sword he left beneath a boulder had ever actually mattered to anyone. And now, in his own hall at his own table, he looks up and sees that exact sword, unmistakable, resting in the hand of a stranger who is not a stranger at all. Aegeus, in a single desperate motion, knocks the poisoned cup from Theseus's hand before he can drink from it, sending it crashing to the floor. Father and son recognize each other in that same instant, decades of separation collapsing into a single moment of understanding. Medea's plot, uncovered in front of the entire court, forces her to flee Athens once again, taking her son Metis with her, disappearing from this particular story as suddenly as she had entered it. Theseus was at last acknowledged as the true son and heir of Aegeus, king of Athens. You might think that would be the natural conclusion of this part of the tale, a happy reunion, a hero finally welcomed home. But Athens in this era was far from peaceful, and Theseus's arrival, rather than settling things, was about to stir up an entirely new source of conflict. The 50 cousins, let's slow down here for a moment and talk about the political situation Theseus had just walked into, because understanding it helps everything that follows make sense. Aegeus had a brother named Pallas, and Pallas had, depending on which ancient source you consult, somewhere between 40 and 50 sons. For years, these nephews of Aegeus, sometimes called the Pallantides, had been quietly assuming that one of them, eventually, would inherit the throne of Athens, since Aegeus himself had no acknowledged son of his own, at least not until Theseus's sudden and dramatic arrival. Try to imagine what it must have felt like, from their perspective, watching an unfamiliar young man walk into the city, reveal himself with a sword and a pair of old sandals, and instantly displace decades of careful political positioning. Whatever ambitions those 50 cousins had been nursing, quietly or not so quietly for years, were suddenly rendered meaningless. They didn't accept this quietly. According to the old accounts, the Pallantides organized an armed rebellion, splitting their forces into two groups in an attempt to catch Theseus and Aegeus's loyalists in a pincer movement, one group approaching openly while the other lay in ambush along a different route. But their plan was betrayed. A herald named Leos, who had apparently been secretly aware of the plot, warned Theseus of what was coming. Theseus, using the same combination of strength and cleverness that had carried him along the bandit-infested coastal road, ambushed the ambushers instead, catching his cousins by surprise and defeating them decisively. This wasn't a bloodless resolution, and the old stories don't pretend otherwise. Many of the Pallantides were killed in this conflict, a grim reminder that succession disputes in these ancient monarchies were rarely settled through polite negotiation. Power in this world often had to be secured through force, and Theseus's claim to Athens, even with his father still alive and on the throne, was cemented not just through blood and recognition, but through his willingness and ability to defend that position militarily. With his cousins defeated and his position in Athens finally secure, you might expect Theseus to settle into a quiet, comfortable life as the acknowledged prince of a city that finally accepted him. And for a little while, perhaps, life did become calmer. But there was one more danger still lurking near Athens, something that had already caused Aegeus considerable grief in years past, something that connects directly to the much larger and darker story we're building toward tonight. The Bull of Marathon, some distance from the city of Athens, near a plain called Marathon, a location that would become famous centuries later for an entirely different and equally dramatic reason. There roamed a monstrous bull, one that had already caused a great deal of suffering in the region. This creature had a long and tangled history of its own. Many ancient sources connect it directly to the same bull that would later be involved in the much darker story of the Minotaur, suggesting that this Marathonian bull was originally a magnificent white bull sent up from the sea by the god Poseidon as a gift to King Minos of Crete, a gift Minos was expected to sacrifice back to the god in gratitude. When Minos, struck by the animal's extraordinary beauty, decided to keep it for himself instead and sacrificed a lesser bull in its place, Poseidon, in a fit of divine anger, cursed the animal, driving it into a wild, destructive rage. And in the most infamous part of that particular tale, cursed Minos's wife Pasiphae with an unnatural passion for the very creature, a story we'll need to return to shortly, because it's the true origin point of the Minotaur itself. Somewhere along the way, this same cursed bull had made its way to the Greek mainland, terrorizing the countryside around Marathon, trampling crops, killing livestock, and in earlier stories, having already claimed the life of one of Aegeus's own sons from another relationship, a young man named Androgeus, who had attempted to capture the beast and died in the attempt. This detail matters enormously, and we'll come back to it very soon, because Androgeus's death is, in many versions of this larger story, the true spark that ignites the terrible tribute Athens was later forced to pay to Crete. Theseus set out to Marathon to finally deal with the bull that had haunted the region for so long. Along the way, according to one especially charming detail preserved in the old stories, he stopped for the night at the humble home of an elderly woman named Hecate, who offered him simple, warm hospitality, food and shelter freely given to a stranger despite her own modest means. This small act of kindness apparently left such an impression on Theseus that after he successfully captured the bull, he returned to properly thank her, only to discover that she had died while he was away. In her memory, Theseus is said to have established a religious ritual honoring her, along with the founding of a local shrine, a quiet reminder that even in stories dominated by monsters and heroes, ordinary human kindness left its own lasting mark. Rather than simply killing the bull outright, Theseus managed to capture it alive, subduing the enormous, dangerous animal through sheer strength and skill, and led it back through the streets of Athens as a public display before finally sacrificing it to the god Apollo. This achievement mattered enormously to the people of Athens, not just as an impressive feat of individual bravery, but as a genuine relief from a threat that had been terrorizing the countryside for years. Theseus was, once again, proving himself not simply as an heir by blood, but as a protector the people could genuinely rely on. But even as Athens celebrated this victory, a much darker cloud continued to hang over the city, one that Theseus's triumph over the Marathonian bull hadn't touched at all. Because every year, or according to some versions, every 9 years, the city of Athens was forced to send a tribute across the sea to Crete. And that tribute wasn't grain, or gold, or fine woven cloth. It was children. The terrible tribute let's slow all the way down here, because this is the darkest and most important part of the whole story, the piece everything else has been building toward. To understand why Athens was paying this tribute, we need to go back to that son of Aegeus we mentioned a moment ago, Androgeus, killed by the same monstrous bull that Theseus would later capture at Marathon. Androgeus, according to the stories, had traveled to Athens from Crete to compete in athletic games, and he had won every single event so decisively that he became something of a local celebrity, admired by the Athenian crowds. But that admiration apparently curdled into resentment among some. Different versions of the story offer different explanations for what happened next. Some say Aegeus himself, growing uneasy at how popular this foreign prince was becoming among his own people, sent Androgeus off to fight the Marathonian bull, specifically hoping he would be killed. Others say jealous rivals ambushed and murdered him after his athletic victories. And still others simply attribute his death to the bull itself, with no human conspiracy involved at all. Whatever the true cause, when word of Androgeus's death reached his father, King Minos of Crete, on the island across the sea, the response was swift and devastating. Minos, believing Athens directly responsible for his son's murder, declared war. Now, I want you to picture the actual power imbalance at play here, because it matters enormously for understanding why Athens accepted such a horrifying arrangement rather than simply fighting back. Crete in this era controlled the most powerful navy in the entire Aegean Sea. Minos's fleet dominated the surrounding waters, and Athens, still a relatively small and developing city-state at this point in its history, had no realistic way to match that kind of naval power. When Minos's ships arrived off the Athenian coast, the city faced a genuine existential threat, made even worse, according to some versions of the story, by a terrible famine and plague that struck the city around the same time, which the Athenians interpreted as further divine punishment for Androgeus's death. Desperate, the Athenians consulted the oracle at Delphi once again, and were told that they needed to submit to whatever terms Minos demanded in order to end their suffering. And the terms Minos demanded were horrifying in their specificity. Every year, or in the more commonly told version, every 9 years, Athens was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women, all of them likely teenagers rather than adults, chosen from among the city's own families, across the sea to Crete. And on Crete, these 14 young Athenians would be sent into a vast, labyrinthine structure built by the legendary craftsman Daedalus, where a monstrous creature waited inside, half man and half bull, a creature born from that same terrible curse Poseidon had placed on Minos's wife Pasiphae after Minos kept the white bull for himself rather than sacrificing it as promised. This creature was the Minotaur. I think it's worth pausing here before we go any further to really sit with what this tribute must have meant for ordinary families in Athens. Try to imagine being a parent in this city, knowing that every so often lots would be drawn, and there was a real chance your own child, a son or daughter you had raised from infancy, fed, comforted through illness, watched take their first steps, could be selected and sent away on a ship, never to return. Imagine the atmosphere in the city each time that selection approached, the dread hanging over households, the desperate hope that this time at least your family would be spared. Some ancient sources suggest the selection process wasn't entirely random, that wealthy or politically connected families sometimes found ways to protect their own children, while poorer families bore a disproportionate share of the burden. A detail that, if true, adds an even more bitter layer of injustice to an already horrifying arrangement. Whether or not that specific detail reflects genuine historical practice, it certainly reflects something ancient audiences would have recognized as painfully realistic. The way disasters and burdens in any society tend to fall hardest on those with the least power to resist them. By the time Theseus had grown into a young man and made his way to Athens, this terrible tribute had already been paid multiple times. 14 young Athenians, sons and daughters of ordinary families, had already been sent across the sea and never returned. And when the time came once again for the ships to be prepared for another round of tribute, Theseus made a decision that would define the rest of his life and would finally bring us to the heart of the story we came here tonight to tell. He volunteered to go himself. A prince volunteers. I want you to imagine the scene when Theseus first announced his intention, because the old stories suggest it caused an uproar in the palace unlike almost anything before it. Aegeus, we're told, was horrified. He had only just been reunited with his son after decades of separation, had only just secured his succession after defeating his rebellious nephews, and now Theseus was proposing to willingly board a ship bound for near certain death, the same fate that had already claimed 14 young Athenians before him, none of whom had returned. But Theseus was resolute. Different ancient sources give slightly different reasons for his decision, and I think it's worth considering a few of them together, because, taken as a whole, they paint a picture of a young man motivated by several overlapping impulses at once. Some accounts emphasize simple, heroic ambition, the same drive that had led him to walk the dangerous coastal road rather than take the safe sea route to Athens in the first place. Having already proven himself against bandits and monsters, the Minotaur represented, in this reading, the ultimate test of his growing reputation. Other accounts frame it more selflessly, as an act of genuine sacrifice. Theseus, in this version, simply couldn't bear the thought of more ordinary Athenian families losing their children while he, as the king's own son, remained safely at home. If someone had to go, he reasoned, better it be him, someone who at least had a fighting chance of surviving, rather than another innocent teenager selected essentially at random. And still other versions suggest a mixture of both, along with a quieter, more personal motivation, a desire to finally end this terrible arrangement once and for all, either by killing the Minotaur directly or by convincing Minos to end the tribute through some other means. Whatever combination of motives drove him, Theseus insisted, and eventually, Aegeus, unable to talk his son out of it, relented, though not without extracting one crucial promise first. The ships that carried the tribute to Crete traditionally sailed under black sails, a visible mark of mourning for a voyage that everyone assumed would end in death. Aegeus asked Theseus for one thing in return for allowing him to go. If by some miracle Theseus succeeded and survived, he was to change the ship's sails from black to white on the journey home, so that Aegeus, watching anxiously from the cliffs above Athens for the ship's return, would know his son was alive the moment he caught sight of the sail on the horizon, rather than enduring the agony of waiting for the ship to dock before learning the truth. Theseus agreed. I want you to hold onto that small, simple promise for now, that detail about the black and white sails, because it's going to matter enormously later in this story, in a way that will feel almost unbearably ironic once we get there. But we'll come back to it. For now, let's follow Theseus down to the harbor, where the ship bound for Crete is being prepared. The voyage to Crete. Let's go inside the scene at the Athenian harbor on the morning the tribute ship departed. Imagine the crowd gathered there, families of the 13 other young people selected alongside Theseus, weeping, embracing their children one final time, uncertain whether this goodbye would be the last one they ever shared. The ship itself would have been a fairly modest vessel by later standards, a wooden galley with a single mast, its black sail already raised, oars lining both sides for when the wind failed. 14 young Athenians boarded, along with whatever crew was needed to sail and guide the vessel, knowing that this same ship, or one very much like it, had made this exact journey before, and had returned each time without the children it had carried away. The crossing itself would have taken a couple of days, depending on wind and weather, sailing south across open water before the island of Crete rose up on the horizon, a landscape very different from the Greek mainland these young Athenians had grown up in. I want you to imagine what Crete must have looked like to eyes seeing it for the very first time. Where Athens in this era was a modest hilltop settlement, the Minoan civilization on Crete was, by comparison, extraordinarily sophisticated. The palace at Knossos, which archaeologists have since excavated and studied extensively, was an enormous multi-story complex, filled with vividly painted frescoes showing dolphins leaping through blue water, processions of elegantly dressed figures, and those famous scenes of young athletes vaulting over the horns of charging bulls. The Minoans had sophisticated plumbing systems, terracotta pipes carrying water and waste through the palace in ways that wouldn't be matched again in much of Europe for centuries. Their pottery was famously delicate and beautifully decorated. Their trade network stretched across the entire eastern Mediterranean, reaching Egypt and the Near East. For 14 young Athenians arriving as tribute rather than as honored guests, this dazzling, wealthy civilization must have felt like an especially cruel contrast, arriving in chains, in a manner of speaking, at the doorstep of one of the most advanced societies of their era, all of it built, in part, on the same wealth and power that allowed Minos to demand such a terrible price from a smaller, weaker rival city. Upon arrival, the group would have been presented to King Minos himself, and it's here that another crucial figure enters our story, someone whose actions are going to determine whether Theseus survives what comes next at all. That figure was Ariadne, daughter of King Minos. Ariadne's thread let's slow down here, because this next part of the story is really about two people meeting for the first time, under circumstances about as strange and high stakes as circumstances can get. Ariadne, according to the old accounts, saw Theseus among the group of tribute, and something about him, his bearing, his evident strength, perhaps simply the desperate courage of his situation, caught her attention immediately. Different ancient sources frame this differently. Some simply say she fell in love with him at first sight, the kind of instant, overwhelming attraction so common in myth. Others suggest more strategic motivations, that Ariadne, aware of her father's cruelty and the horror of what awaited these young Athenians, was moved by something closer to compassion, or perhaps a genuine desire to defy a father whose methods she had come to find monstrous. Whatever her exact motivations, Ariadne made a choice that put her own safety at risk in order to help Theseus survive. She knew something crucial about the labyrinth that housed the Minotaur, something that made all the difference. The structure had been designed by Daedalus, a legendary craftsman and inventor who had built the labyrinth specifically to be so complex, so full of twisting passages and dead ends, that no one who entered it could ever find their way back out again, trapping the Minotaur inside while ensuring that anyone sent in to face it had no possible escape route, even if they somehow survived the encounter itself. Ariadne approached Daedalus secretly and asked for his help in giving Theseus a chance. Daedalus, according to the stories, gave her a solution both simple and brilliant: A ball of thread. The idea was straightforward once you hear it, though it clearly required real cleverness to think of in the first place. Theseus would tie one end of the thread securely at the labyrinth's entrance, and as he ventured deeper into its winding passages, he would let the thread unspool behind him, marking his exact path. Then, whether he succeeded or failed in his confrontation with the Minotaur, he would be able to follow that same thread back out, retracing his own footsteps through a maze specifically designed to make retracing your steps impossible. Ariadne met with Theseus privately before he was due to enter the labyrinth, and gave him this thread, along with, in some versions of the story, a sword smuggled in to help him against the Minotaur, since tribute was typically sent in unarmed. In exchange for this life-saving gift, she asked for one thing in return. She wanted Theseus to take her away from Crete with him, back to Athens, where she could escape a father whose cruelty had clearly become unbearable to her, and become his wife. Theseus agreed. I want you to sit with this exchange for a moment, because it's really the emotional turning point of the entire Minotaur story. Everything that happens next, the actual confrontation inside the labyrinth, only becomes possible because of this quiet, private act of defiance between two young people, one a foreign prince facing near certain death, the other a princess willing to betray her own father's terrible arrangement in order to help him. With the thread secured and his plan set, the day arrived when Theseus, along with the other 13 young Athenians, was led toward the entrance of the labyrinth. Let's go there together now. Into the labyrinth, I want you to imagine standing at the entrance to this structure, because even second-hand, even filtered through thousands of years of retelling, it's a genuinely unsettling image to picture clearly. The labyrinth, as ancient writers described it, was not simply a maze of hedges or garden pathways the way we might picture such a thing today. It was an enormous, dark stone structure, its passages twisting and doubling back on themselves in ways specifically engineered to disorient anyone who entered. Some ancient accounts describe it as sitting beneath or alongside the great palace of Knossos itself. And interestingly, when archaeologists later excavated that actual palace, they found its layout to be genuinely, remarkably complex, room after room connected by winding corridors and staircases, enough that some visitors in antiquity, seeing the ruins centuries after the palace had fallen out of use, apparently believed they were looking at the physical remains of the mythical labyrinth itself. Whatever the true architectural reality behind the myth, the emotional experience the story asks us to imagine is clear enough. Darkness, cold stone underfoot and against the walls, the oppressive silence of a structure built specifically to trap and disorient. And somewhere within it, a creature that was, according to every version of this story, terrifying to behold, a being with the body of a man but the head and considerable strength of a bull, a creature born from a curse and raised, we're told, on a diet of human flesh, specifically the flesh of the tribute sent from Athens every cycle. Theseus entered first, or in some versions led the other tribute in together, securing his thread at the entrance before beginning to move deeper into the winding passages, letting the line unspool behind him just as Ariadne and Daedalus had instructed. Let's imagine what that walk must have felt like, moving deeper and deeper into a structure that seemed to fold in on itself, passages branching and rebranching, the light from outside growing fainter with every turn, replaced eventually by nothing. But whatever faint illumination came from cracks in the stone above, or perhaps by no light at all, forcing Theseus to feel his way forward using touch alone in the deepest sections. Somewhere in that darkness, the Minotaur waited. Different ancient sources describe the confrontation itself with varying levels of detail, but the core of the story remains consistent across nearly every version. Theseus, whether guided by the sword Ariadne had smuggled to him, or, in some accounts, forced to rely on his bare hands and sheer strength alone, fought the Minotaur in the depths of the labyrinth and killed it. I think it's worth resisting the urge to imagine this as a dramatic, prolonged battle scene, the kind you might picture in a modern film with music swelling and blows raining down for minutes on end. The oldest versions of this story tend to describe the confrontation itself fairly briefly, almost matter-of-factly, as though the real tension of the tale lies not in the fight itself, but in everything surrounding it: the darkness, the isolation, the years of dread this creature had inspired across an entire city, finally resolving in a single, decisive moment. With the Minotaur dead, Theseus turned back the way he had come, following the thread Ariadne had given him back through the labyrinth's winding passages, back toward the entrance, back toward daylight, back toward a version of his future that just hours earlier had seemed almost impossible to imagine. He gathered the other Athenian tribute, all of them alive, all of them spared the fate that had claimed the young people sent before them. And together, they made their way back to the ships, joined now by Ariadne, who had risked everything, her own family, her own home, her own safety, to make this rescue possible in the first place. The escape from Crete before they could sail away safely. There was still the matter of Minos's powerful navy to consider, a fleet capable of pursuing and destroying their ship if they simply tried to sail off in the ordinary way. According to some versions of the story, Theseus and his companions took the precaution of damaging the hulls of the Cretan ships in the harbor before they departed, disabling Minos's fleet just enough to buy themselves the time needed to escape without fear of immediate pursuit. With that danger addressed, the ship carrying Theseus, Ariadne, and the rescued tribute finally set sail, leaving the island of Crete behind, heading back across the open water toward home. I want you to imagine the mood aboard that ship in those first hours after departure. Relief, certainly, an almost disbelieving kind of relief among the young Athenians who had genuinely expected to die, now finding themselves instead sailing home to families who had likely already begun mourning them. And alongside that relief, something more complicated in Theseus himself, a young man now responsible not just for his own safety, but for a princess who had abandoned everything she knew in order to help him. Their first stop, according to most versions of the story, was the island of Knossos, a beautiful spot in the Aegean known even in antiquity for its natural beauty. And it's here that the story takes one of its strangest and most debated turns. Theseus left Ariadne on Knossos. The ancient sources genuinely disagree on why this happened, and it's worth walking through a few of the possibilities honestly, rather than pretending there's a single, settled answer, because there really isn't. Some versions suggest Theseus simply abandoned her, perhaps having grown tired of an arrangement made in desperation rather than genuine love, perhaps calculating that a foreign princess would complicate his political standing back in Athens. This version paints Theseus in a fairly unflattering light, a hero willing to accept crucial help and then discard the person who provided it once it was no longer needed. Other versions offer a gentler, more mythologically elaborate explanation. In this telling, the god Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream or through some divine sign and claimed Ariadne for himself, declaring that she was fated to become his consort rather than remaining with Theseus. In these versions, Theseus doesn't so much abandon Ariadne as have her taken from him by divine intervention beyond his control, and Ariadne herself, rather than being left in tragic isolation, goes on to become the wife of a god, eventually achieving a kind of immortality herself. Still other versions suggest simple accident or misfortune, that a storm or some other practical complication separated the ship from Ariadne while she slept on the shore, without any deliberate choice on Theseus's part at all. I think it's worth sitting honestly with the fact that we simply don't know which version, if any, reflects whatever original story this myth first grew from. What we can say is that ancient Greek culture clearly found this ambiguity compelling rather than unsatisfying, retelling this abandonment across centuries of poetry, pottery, and drama, often leaning into its tragic, bittersweet qualities rather than resolving them neatly. Ariadne, left alone on that beach at Naxos, watching Theseus's ship disappear over the horizon, became one of the most enduring images of heartbreak in the ancient world, immortalized in countless paintings and poems long after the original myth had taken shape. Whatever the reason for their separation, Theseus continued his journey home without her, and this is where we need to return to that small, seemingly simple promise he had made to his father before ever setting sail for Crete. The promise about the sails. Black sails, let's go back to that moment on the ship, sailing north from Naxos toward Athens, carrying Theseus and the 12 other surviving Athenians, though notably now without Ariadne. Somewhere in the emotional chaos of these events, the death of the Minotaur, the complicated departure from Crete, the confusing and painful separation from Ariadne on Naxos, Theseus forgot to change the ship's sail from black to white. I want you to sit with how devastating this small detail is, once you understand its full weight. Back in Athens, King Aegeus had spent the entire duration of his son's absence in a state of unbearable anxiety. We're told, watching the horizon from a high point along the coast, sometimes identified specifically as the cliffs of Cape Saunian, waiting for any sign of the ship's return, knowing that the color of its sail would tell him, from a great distance, whether his son had survived or died, before the ship ever came close enough to shore for him to receive any other kind of news. When the ship finally came into view, still flying its black sail, Aegeus, seeing what he believed to be undeniable confirmation that his son had died in the labyrinth, was overcome with grief. According to the most commonly told version of this story, Aegeus, in his despair, threw himself from the cliffs into the sea below and drowned. This is, according to ancient tradition, the origin of the name we still use today for that particular body of water, the Aegean Sea, named in memory of this grieving king, who died believing he had lost his only son at the very moment that son was, in fact, alive and sailing home in triumph. I think this detail deserves a moment of real quiet reflection, because it captures something achingly, permanently human about this entire story. A single forgotten gesture, a sail left the wrong color through simple human distraction in the aftermath of overwhelming events, led directly to the death of a father who had waited his entire life for exactly this kind of joyful reunion, only to lose it in the cruelest possible way, moments before it could actually happen. Theseus arrived home victorious, having killed the Minotaur, having freed Athens from its terrible tribute forever, having saved the lives of 13 young Athenians who would otherwise have died, and found, waiting for him instead of a joyful reunion, only grief and a kingdom suddenly, unexpectedly his own. He became king of Athens that same day, inheriting a throne under the worst possible circumstances, a triumph and a tragedy arriving in the very same breath. A king's long reign. Let's slow down here for a while, because most retellings of this story tend to rush past everything that happened after the Minotaur, treating that single dramatic episode as though it were the entire point of Theseus's life. But the old accounts actually describe a long and eventful reign that followed, full of the ordinary, complicated business of actually governing a kingdom, which I think deserves its own quiet attention tonight. One of the achievements ancient writers consistently credit to Theseus is something called the synokismos, a Greek word that essentially means the bringing together of separate settlements into one unified political community. Before Theseus, the region of Attica, the broader territory surrounding Athens, was apparently made up of a scattering of smaller, independent villages and towns, each with its own local government and interests, only loosely connected to one another. According to tradition, Theseus traveled throughout this region, persuading these separate communities to give up their individual governments and unite instead under a single, shared Athenian identity, with one central government based in Athens itself. Whether this happened through the peaceful persuasion the myths describe, or through a longer, messier process of political and military pressure that later storytellers simplified into a single heroic narrative, the underlying historical reality does seem to reflect something real. Athens did, at some point in its early development, absorb the surrounding region of Attica into a unified political structure, becoming one of the larger and more cohesive city-states in ancient Greece as a result. And this achievement was consistently remembered and celebrated by later Athenians as one of Theseus's most important legacies, arguably more significant in the long run than his more famous encounter with the Minotaur. Alongside this political unification, tradition credits Theseus with instituting the Isthmian Games, a set of athletic competitions held on the isthmus near Corinth, one of several major athletic festivals in the ancient Greek world, alongside the more famous Olympic Games. Establishing recurring festivals like this served an important political function beyond simple entertainment, providing regular opportunities for different Greek communities to gather peacefully, compete, and reinforce shared cultural bonds, something particularly valuable for a fractious, decentralized world made up of many small, independent city-states that otherwise had few unifying institutions holding them together. Theseus's reign also included further adventures beyond the political work of governing, because ancient storytellers were rarely content to let a hero simply settle into quiet administrative life. Among the most famous of these later adventures was his participation in the hunt for the Caledonian boar, a massive, destructive beast terrorizing the region of Caledon, an adventure that brought together many of the most famous heroes from across the Greek mythological tradition in a single shared story, a kind of gathering of legendary figures that ancient audiences seem to particularly enjoy imagining. Theseus was also remembered as one of the Argonauts in some versions of that story, joining Jason's crew aboard the ship Argo in their quest for the Golden Fleece, though his role in that particular tale tends to be relatively minor compared to his more central position in his own stories. And then there was his relationship with the Amazons, a legendary tribe of warrior women who appear throughout Greek mythology. According to tradition, Theseus either captured or was given, depending on the version, an Amazon woman named Antiope, or in some accounts named Hippolytus, and made her his wife or companion. This union eventually led to conflict, as the Amazons launched an invasion of Attica in an attempt to reclaim their kinswoman, resulting in a war fought, according to some ancient accounts, within sight of the Acropolis itself, a detail some later historians connected to genuine burial mounds and monuments that existed in and around Athens, monuments that ancient Athenians themselves pointed to as physical evidence that this legendary battle had really happened on their own soil. From his relationship with Antiope, Theseus had a son named Hippolytus, and it's through this son that one of the most genuinely tragic chapters of Theseus's later life unfolds. Phaedra and Hippolytus, after the Amazon conflict eventually settled, and after Antiope's story concluded, in most versions with her death, Theseus eventually married again, this time to Phaedra, who happened to be the sister of Ariadne, making her, in a strange and uncomfortable twist of fate, the sister of the very woman Theseus had once loved and then abandoned on Knossos all those years earlier. This marriage set the stage for one of the most devastating tragedies in Theseus's entire story, one that later became the subject of one of ancient Greece's most famous surviving plays, written by the tragedian Euripides. Phaedra, according to the myth, fell into a desperate, forbidden love with her own stepson, Hippolytus, Theseus's son from his earlier relationship with Antiope. Hippolytus, for his part, had dedicated himself entirely to the goddess Artemis, embracing a life of hunting and chastity, and had firmly rejected any romantic attention, including, according to the myth, romantic attention from the goddess Aphrodite herself, an insult that goddess apparently never forgave, and which some versions of the story credit as the true underlying cause of everything that follows, Aphrodite deliberately cursing Phaedra with this impossible, shameful love as punishment aimed indirectly at Hippolytus. When Hippolytus rejected Phaedra's advances, she was consumed by shame and fear that her secret might become known. In her desperation, according to the most common version of the tale, she took her own life, but not before leaving behind a note falsely accusing Hippolytus of having assaulted her, an accusation intended, in her final desperate act, to protect her own reputation at the cost of an innocent young man's life. Theseus, discovering his wife dead and reading her accusation, believed it completely, and in his grief and rage, called upon a curse he had once been granted by the god Poseidon, invoking that divine power against his own son, asking that Hippolytus be destroyed. The curse worked with horrifying speed. As Hippolytus rode his chariot along the coast, Poseidon sent a monstrous bull from the sea, terrifying his horses, causing them to bolt in panic and drag Hippolytus to his death against the rocks. Only afterward, in most versions of this tragedy, does Theseus learn the truth, that his son had been entirely innocent, that Phaedra's accusation had been a desperate lie born from shame rather than genuine violation. Theseus is left, in the aftermath, with the unbearable knowledge that his own rage and his own trust in a dead woman's false words had led him to destroy his own child. I think this particular chapter of Theseus's story deserves a slow, quiet moment of reflection, because it strips away almost entirely the heroic, monster-slaying image we usually associate with him, and replaces it instead with something much more painfully, recognizably human. A father, deceived and grieving, making an irreversible decision in a moment of overwhelming emotion, only to discover the devastating consequences once it's far too late to undo them. Ancient Greek tragedy returned again and again to exactly this kind of story, not because ancient audiences enjoyed suffering for its own sake, but because these stories offered a way of thinking honestly about grief, error, and the terrible weight of decisions made without complete information, themes that remain just as relevant to anyone listening tonight as they were to audiences watching this same story performed on an Athenian stage over 2,000 years ago. The final years Theseus's life, according to the old traditions, continued on well past this tragedy, though the stories from this final stretch of his reign tend to grow increasingly somber, reflecting perhaps a broader pattern in how ancient storytellers like to shape the arcs of their great heroes, allowing them a long and celebrated middle life before eventually bringing them to a quieter, sadder conclusion. One of the final major adventures attributed to Theseus involves his close friendship with a fellow hero named Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, a friendship the ancient stories consistently describe with real warmth and depth, the two men having apparently first tested each other's strength in battle before recognizing a kindred spirit in one another and becoming lifelong companions. Together, in one of the more troubling episodes of Theseus's later life, the two friends apparently made a reckless pact to each help the other win a wife who was, in both cases, entirely inappropriate and unwilling. Theseus, according to this tradition, helped Pirithous attempt to abduct Persephone, queen of the underworld, from the realm of Hades itself, an act of extraordinary hubris that resulted in both men becoming trapped in the underworld, held captive on a stone seat that, according to some versions, fused permanently to their skin, a fittingly strange and mythic punishment for such an audacious crime. Theseus was eventually rescued from this underworld imprisonment, in most versions, by his old friend and fellow hero Heracles, the same cousin whose lion's skin had once frightened Theseus as a child back in Troezen, arriving during one of his own famous labors and freeing Theseus, though Pirithous, in most versions, remained trapped in the underworld forever, unable to be saved. By the time Theseus returned to Athens after this ordeal, the political situation in his own city had shifted dramatically against him. A usurper named Menestheus had used Theseus's prolonged absence to turn the Athenian people against their long-absent king, and Theseus, arriving home, found a city no longer willing to accept his rule. Rather than fighting to reclaim a throne that had once been so central to his entire life story, Theseus, in a quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion to everything that came before, chose to leave Athens rather than plunge his city into further conflict. He traveled to the island of Skyros, seeking refuge with a king there named Lycomedes, a man he apparently believed to be a friend and ally. But Lycomedes, for reasons the ancient sources never fully explain, whether out of fear of Theseus's reputation, pressure from Menestheus, or some private grievance we simply don't know about, led Theseus to a high cliff on the island, under the pretense of showing him the view, and pushed him to his death. It's a strange, quiet, almost deflating ending for a man remembered as one of the greatest heroes of the ancient Greek world, killed not in glorious battle against a monster, but through simple betrayal by someone he had trusted, far from the city he had once saved and unified. And yet, this wasn't quite the end of Theseus's story either, at least not as far as later Athenians were concerned. A hero's long afterlife centuries after Theseus's death, according to the historian Plutarch, who wrote one of the most detailed surviving biographical accounts of Theseus's life, sometime around the end of the 1st century after Christ. The Athenians had never entirely forgotten their old, exiled king, and in the 5th century before Christ, following a military victory over the island of Skyros, the Athenian general Cimon supposedly claimed to have discovered bones there believed to belong to Theseus himself. These bones were brought back to Athens with great ceremony, according to Plutarch's account, and given a proper, honored burial within the city, an act meant to symbolically bring their ancient hero home at last, correcting, in a sense, the injustice of his lonely death in exile. Whether these bones genuinely belonged to Theseus, whether Theseus was ever a real, specific historical individual at all rather than a composite figure built up over generations of storytelling, is something we simply cannot know for certain, separated as we are by so many centuries and so many layers of myth and embellishment from whatever original events, if any, first inspired these stories. What we can say with confidence is that the Athenians themselves clearly wanted to believe in him, treated him as a genuine ancestor and founding figure rather than simply an entertaining story, built shrines and held festivals in his honor, and used his legendary unification of Attica as a foundational myth explaining their own city's identity and origins. There's something worth sitting with in that fact alone, regardless of how much or how little of the Theseus story reflects literal historical truth. Stories like this one served a real, important function for the people who told and retold them, generation after generation. They offered explanations for why the world looked the way it did, why Athens was unified rather than fragmented, why certain religious festivals existed, why a particular sea carried the name it did. They offered models, however flawed and complicated, for what courage and leadership might look like. And they offered, perhaps most importantly for an evening like this one, simply a good story, one compelling enough to survive being told and retold across more than 3,000 years, changing shape slightly with each new generation of storytellers, but never quite disappearing entirely. What the stones remember before we close things out tonight. I want to take a few quiet minutes to think a little more about that real historical backdrop sitting underneath all of this myth, because I think it deepens the story rather than diminishing it. The Minoan civilization on Crete, the real historical culture that likely inspired much of the Minotaur legend, flourished for centuries, reaching its height sometime around 1700 to 1450 years before Christ, before declining for reasons that historians and archaeologists still debate today. Some point to a massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Phaedra, modern-day Santorini, an eruption powerful enough to have caused devastating tsunamis and ash fall across the region, potentially crippling Minoan agriculture and trade. Others point to eventual conquest or absorption by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, the same broader culture that Bronze Age Athens itself would have belonged to. That word, labyrinth, may itself carry an echo of real Minoan history within it. Some scholars connect it to the word labries, referring to a double-headed axe that appears repeatedly in Minoan art and religious symbolism, found carved into walls and depicted in ceremonial contexts throughout Minoan archaeological sites. If that connection is accurate, the labyrinth might originally have meant something closer to House of the Double Axe, a reference to the palace at Knossos itself, rather than specifically referring to a maze-like structure in the way we understand the word today. Over centuries of retelling, this architectural reference to a real, complex Minoan palace may have gradually transformed, in the popular imagination, into the literal maze filled with twisting passages that the myth eventually describes. As for the bull imagery running throughout this entire story, from the white bull sent by Poseidon, to Pasiphae's curse, to the Minotaur itself, to the Marathonian bull Theseus later captures, archaeologists have found genuine, extensive evidence that bulls held deep religious and symbolic significance throughout Minoan culture. Those famous frescoes of bull leaping we mentioned earlier really do exist, painted onto the walls of the palace at Knossos, showing young men and women in the midst of an athletic, ritualistic interaction with these enormous, dangerous animals. We don't know exactly what this practice meant to the Minoans themselves, whether it was primarily religious ceremony, athletic competition, or some combination of both. But its clear importance in their art suggests that when later Greek storytellers imagined Crete as a place ruled by bull-related danger and mystery, they may have been drawing on some genuine cultural memory, however distorted, of a real and distinctive practice. And then there's the tribute itself, those 14 young Athenians sent across the sea. While we obviously have no direct evidence of a literal Minotaur receiving human sacrifices in an underground maze, Historians have long speculated that this element of the story might reflect a genuine historical memory of political subjugation, a period when a smaller, less powerful mainland settlement like early Athens might indeed have been forced to send some form of tribute, whether goods, labor, or even hostages, to a more powerful maritime civilization like Minoan Crete, which dominated Aegean trade and likely held real political and economic leverage over smaller communities throughout the region during this era. It's a genuinely fascinating thing to consider, lying here in the dark tonight, that underneath this fantastical story of monsters and mazes and heroic rescues, there may be buried, however faintly, an actual folk memory of real political relationships between real ancient peoples, transformed slowly over centuries of retelling into something that feels, on the surface, almost entirely fictional. A final, quiet thought as we come toward the end of tonight's story. I want to leave you with one last thought before we let the silence settle in. We tend to remember Theseus, when we remember him at all in casual conversation, purely as the hero who killed the Minotaur, a single dramatic image frozen in time, sword raised, monster defeated, thread trailing behind him through dark stone corridors. And that moment certainly deserves its place at the center of his story. It's a genuinely powerful image, one that has inspired artists and storytellers for thousands of years. And there's a reason it's the piece of this myth that has survived most vividly into our own modern imagination. But spending an entire evening moving slowly through his whole story, from a boy lifting a boulder on a quiet beach in Troezen, through a dangerous road cleared of bandits one by one, through a poisoned cup nearly lifted to his lips, through the labyrinth itself and the complicated departure that followed, through a father's grief-stricken death and a long, complicated reign as king, through triumph and betrayal and eventually tragedy involving his own son, and finally through a lonely death far from the city that once celebrated him, I think we come away with something richer than a single heroic image. We come away with a portrait of an entire human life, however wrapped in myth and legend it might be, full of the same complicated mixture of courage and mistake, love and loss, triumph and grief that makes up any real human existence. Theseus wasn't simply a monster slayer. He was a son navigating a complicated relationship with an anxious father, a young man testing his own strength against a dangerous world, a leader working to unify a fractured region into something stronger, a husband and father who made a devastating mistake in a moment of overwhelming grief, and in the end, simply a man betrayed by someone he trusted, far from home. That's really what these old stories were always trying to do, I think, underneath all their monsters and gods and dramatic reversals. They were trying to help people make sense of what it means to live a whole human life, with all its unpredictable turns, its unearned tragedies and hard-won victories, using language and imagery large enough to hold the full weight of that experience. I hope, wherever you're listening tonight, whatever city or country you're falling asleep in right now, you're feeling calm, feeling ready to let your mind drift off into whatever dreams are waiting for you. There's no need to hold onto any of the details we've talked about tonight. Just let them settle in gently, somewhere in the back of your mind, the way an old story settles into a listener's memory after a long evening by the fire, softening at the edges, blending quietly with sleep. If you enjoyed spending this time with us tonight and you'd like to fall asleep to more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe and maybe let us know down in the comments which historical story you'd like us to tell next, walked through slowly, the same way we've walked through this one tonight. We'll be right here, ready to tell it whenever you're ready to listen again. Sleep well, buddy. Rest easy. And we'll see you next time.